Commercial Leasing Glossary. Commonly used terms in a commercial lease. Assignment and subletting. A transfer of the tenant's entire interest in the lease, where there exists an express covenant in the original lease to pay rent. The assigner, the original tenant, remains secondarily liable to the landlord after an assignment. A sublease is a transaction whereby a tenant grants an interest in the leased premises less than his own. Base rent. The amount of rent to be paid before the inclusion of additional expenses or other factors that increase the amount of rent to be paid. It is typically specified in dollars per square foot per year. Covenants. Clauses in a lease that delineate the rights and obligations of the landlord and tenant. Escalator or escalation clauses. Lease covenants that provide for periodic increases in contract rent and annual increases in operating expenses and property taxes above a base year over the term. Estoppel certificate. A document signed by the tenant concerning the status of an agreement, usually a lease, and the performance of obligations under the agreement, commonly requested as part of a transfer of ownership or refinancing. Exclusivity. Most common in retail leases, this clause provides the tenant with an exclusive right to sell his or her product or service on the property, thus obligating the landlord to prevent other tenants from selling those same goods or services. Extension of a lease. An extension is a continuation of the current lease. This is distinct from a renewal of a lease. Going dark. A go dark provision in a lease is a tenant-driven term whereby the tenant may elect to cease operations in its leased space, but continue to pay rent to the landlord. Graduated rent lease. A graduated rental lease provides for specified changes in the rent at one or more points during the lease term. Gross lease. A gross lease is a lease in which the owner or landlord pays taxes, insurance, maintenance, services, operating cost, etc. The rental rate charged to the tenant is a base rent amount plus a contribution to these expenses. It usually remains constant for the term of the lease. Ground lease. A lease that grants the right to use and occupy land. Improvements made by the ground tenant typically revert to the ground landlord. Landlord, lessor. The one who conveys by lease the right of use of the property to another, the lessor. Landlord improvements. A detailed list of the work to be performed by the landlord at the landlord's expense to the premises, often as an inducement to the tenant to enter into the lease. Lease. A lease is an agreement by which one party, the landlord, gives another party, the tenant, the right to occupy all or part of certain premises or lands for a term in consideration for the payment of rent. A lease gives an interest in land. This term includes not only the lease, but also any amendments, modifications, additions, schedules, appendices, and other documents attached to the lease or otherwise intended to form part of the lease. Leaseback. An arrangement in which the seller of a property agrees to lease the property from the buyer under terms and conditions that are negotiated. Leasehold and leasehold estate. A leasehold is an estate in realty held under a lease. An estate for a fixed term of years. A leasehold estate gives an exclusive right or right to a land parcel, although for a limited amount of time. Leasehold interest. The interest held by the tenant through a lease transferring the rights of use and occupancy for a stated term under certain conditions. Market rent. Market rent is the rent that a property would most probably command in the open market given reasonable exposure. It is indicated by the rents paid as per the recently signed arm's length leases. Market rent is sometimes referred to as economic rent. Modified gross lease. A lease in which the landlord receives stipulated rent and is obligated to pay most but not all of the property's operating expenses and real estate taxes. Month-to-month tenancy. A month-to-month lease agreement, either written or implied by law, is cancelable by either party, usually upon 30 days or 1 month's notice, or by applicable provincial statutes. Net ground lease. A lease of unimproved land in which the tenant agrees to accept and pay the owner's expenses, for example, realty taxes, assessments, as well as all expenses for any improvements created by the tenant. Net lease. In a net lease, the tenant pays a base rent plus its pro rata share of the property taxes, utilities, heating, repairs, maintenance costs, etc. Net lease. A lease in which the tenant pays for utilities, janitorial services, property taxes, and insurance in addition to the rent, and the landlord pays for the maintenance and repairs. Net lease. A net lease under which the tenant assumes all expenses of operating a property, including both fixed and variable expenses and any common area maintenance that might apply, but the landlord is responsible for structural repairs. Operating expenses. Operating expenses are those costs and expenses which pertain to the maintenance, operation, supervision, management, and replacement of the project in which the premises are situate and its components. These include HVAC, electricity, insurance, garbage removal, etc. Overholding. If the tenant remains in possession of the premises after the end of the term without the execution of a new lease, the tenant is deemed to be overholding. Normally, the lease becomes a month-to-month tenancy, and the rent paid is revised in accordance with the wording of this clause. Percentage lease. A lease wherein the tenant, usually retail, is required to pay a specified percentage of gross or net sales made upon the premises. Sometimes it is combined with a base rent. Pro rata or proportionate share. In most leases, tenants pay a contribution to operating expenses based on their pro rata or proportionate share. The normal calculation for this is based on their rentable area, expressed in square feet, divided by the aggregate rentable area in square feet of all portions of the property available for lease. Purchase option. A lease covenant granting the tenant an option to purchase the leased property. The manner in which the option may be exercised varies from lease to lease. Release. The act or writing by which some claim, right, or interest is given up to the person against whom the claim, right, or interest could have been enforced. For example, a person may sign a release that ends his or her right to sue someone for an injury caused by that person. Renegotiation of a lease. To arrive at a new set of lease terms upon termination of an existing lease, generally for the purpose of revising the annual rent. Renewal option. A lease covenant giving the tenant the right but not the obligation to renew for an additional period of years on specified terms. Rent and rental. Rent includes the annual, basic, or minimum rent, which is the basic yearly rent the tenant has to pay. Percentage rent, which is specific to retail premises and calculated as the percentage or the gross or net sales of the tenant, as defined by the lease. And additional rent, which includes the tenant's share of operating costs as well as taxes. Restrictive clauses. Any restrictions on either the landlord or the tenant should be noted and understood. Reversion. A lease gives an interest in land. Exclusive possession of the premises or lands is given to the tenant. The interest in the land remaining is called the reversion. Right of first refusal on additional space. A lease covenant that gives the tenant the right to lease any rentable space which becomes available, such space to be specified as part of the clause. Should the landlord receive a bona fide offer from a third party to lease this specified space, the tenant is to receive a copy of said offer and would have a set number of days within which to take the space on the terms specified in the offer. Should the tenant decline to take the space on these terms, the landlord can proceed with negotiating with the third party. Right of first refusal to purchase the property. A lease covenant that gives the tenant the right to purchase the property in the event the landlord receives a bona fide offer from a third party. Sublandlord, subtenant. When a tenant is permitted to lease its leasehold estate to a third party, the original tenant becomes the sublandlord. The new tenant is the subtenant, and the new agreement between the two parties is known as the sublease. The original lease document may specify a sublease requires approval of the original landlord. Tenant, lessee, the one who possesses the right of possession and enjoyment of the property of another. Tenant improvements, TIs, a detailed list of the work to be performed by the tenant at the tenant's expense. Term, the number of years and months of the lease. Triple net lease. See net lease. Use of premises. Specifies what the premises can be used for by the tenant. And that's it. Thanks for